Chapter 7. Angela drove Kevin home. They spoke little on the way. Kevin was still digesting the news that she had gone out with another guy. Angela couldn't stop thinking about food. She had $9 in her purse, but she wondered if she needed to stop at an automatic teller machine to get more money in order to satisfy her hunger. She hadn't a clue what was causing the immense craving. She couldn't be pregnant, that she knew for sure. Kevin was reluctant to leave her when she stopped in front of his house. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To the library." "Why don't you want me to come with you?" he asked. "Because I'm in a weird mood." "You're always in a weird mood. I can help you." Her stomach growled. It actually felt as if it were digesting itself. "I have to go. Please? I'll call you later." Kevin got out slowly. "What are you doing tonight?" he asked. "I don't know. Resting. I think I do have the flu. I'll call you tomorrow." "Fine." He shut the car door. "Stay away from the bad guys, A&W." "I will." She drove straight to the McDonald's, doing well over the speed limit all the way. She ordered another Big Mac and a Coke, leaving off the fries. It was a relief to put the food in her mouth and chew it. Yet the hamburger didn't satisfy her. They had cooked the meat too much, she thought. Nevertheless, she ordered another burger before she was done swallowing the first one. This time, she told them she wanted it extra rare. The second one tasted better, and her hunger finally began to diminish, although it didn't go away completely. She contemplated ordering a third for the road, in case she got hungry later, but she couldn't eat 3 Big Macs. She'd never eaten 2 before. Next stop was the library. The old woman with the book tapes was behind the desk. She was listening to a Shakespearean play. It sounded like Hamlet. Angela wondered if she should explain to her that there were such things as headphones. The woman smiled kindly at her as she approached the desk. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," Angela said. "I want all the material you have on 2 subjects. The Indians who lived in this area before the white man arrived, and the meteor that created Point Lake." The old woman was excited. She looked like somebody's grandmother who had just gotten stoned on marijuana for the first time. "Do you like Indians?" she asked, turning off her tape. "I love them myself." She began to get up. "I know where every word on them is in this library. You just have a seat and I'll bring you the material. What was the other thing you were interested in? Parking meters?" Angela had to smile. "The meteor that formed the lake." "I'll see what I've got," the woman said. She was gone for some time. Angela worried that she had sat down and dozed off, but eventually she returned with a handful of material. Most of it was magazine articles and loose papers. There was one book, however, small and poorly bound. It looked as if it had been published at home with desktop equipment. Angela thanked the woman and went off in a corner to study. The woman put her tape back on. Hamlet was talking to his father's ghost. There is only one article on the meteor and Point Lake. Angela read it first. The piece started with a discussion on how long ago the meteor, the article never debated for a moment whether it was a meteor or not, hit the Earth. Angela was surprised to learn the author had determined, using a carbon-14 radioactive decay test, that the meteor had hit the area as little as 100,000 years ago. Angela knew a little about astronomy. That wasn't very long ago. The author went on to describe the extremely high magnetic content of the rock in and around Point Lake. He finished by comparing it to another meteor site down in South America that was now also a lake. He said the 2 holes in the ground appeared to have been formed at the same time by the same highly magnetic ore from outer space. He didn't say anything about the water in the lake being unhealthy. Angela made a note of the author's name, Alan Spark. He was a professor of geology at the University of Michigan. That was only a 90-minute drive from Point. Perhaps she'd visit him someday. The material on the Native Americans took longer to wade through. Apparently, the Manton had been the predominant tribe in the region until the white man had arrived a couple of 100 years ago and destroyed their lifestyle. There were numerous anecdotes of battles, of treaties signed, of more battles. It blew Angela's mind how many promises the U.S. government made and broke with the Manton. These Native Americans were either a trusting sort or else they had short memories. Of course, they probably had no choice but to agree to the government's treaties. History was overrunning them and there was no stopping it. Buried in the history were several intriguing references to Point Lake. First off, its Indian name was Sethia, which meant bath of blood. Angela stopped and asked herself why they'd have given such a picturesque lake as Point such a terrible name. She couldn't imagine it and dug deeper for an explanation, figuring there must have been a major battle on its shores, but she could find no such reference. The name Sethia seemed to go way back, thousands of years perhaps. The word appeared loosely connected to another strange word, Katu. There is one story describing how the Katu emerged from the depths of the lake. Another spoke of the Katu coming out of the sky above the water. Try as she might, Angela couldn't find out exactly what the Katu were. In one place, they were described as tiny insects, too small for the human eye to see. In another, they were spoken of as huge bat-like beings that could cross great distances rapidly. In all ways, they were described as deadly and to be feared. Above all, it was clear the Manton avoided Point Lake. It appeared that they successfully quarantined the area around the lake for decades at a time. It was a sacred rule among the Manton that no one of their tribe, under any circumstances, was to drink the water in the lake. "Oh my," Angela muttered to herself. "Somebody should have shown the local Board of Education these stories." "Did you say something, dear?" the old librarian asked, turning off her book tape. Angela had been so engrossed in her research, she didn't know what the woman was listening to now. "I was just remarking to myself how fascinating the Indian history is in this area," Angela said. The woman clapped her hands. She was pleased to find a mutual fan. "Isn't it?" she asked. "But if you really want to hear wonderful stories about the Indians who lived around here, you must talk to Shining Feather. He can tell you stories firsthand. He's been around a long time." "Pardon?" "He's an old Indian who lives off Highway 17 near Windbreak. There's a shop there called Cheap Stuff. It's run by Shining Feather's great-great-granddaughter. You'll have to be careful with her. She'll try to sell you one of those rugs she makes whether you want it or not. I have 3 of her rugs at home in the closet." "How old is this Shining Feather?" Angela asked. "I don't know. He had white hair when I went to visit him for the first time." The old woman stopped and scratched her balding white head. She frowned. "That was back in the Depression, when I was a little girl." Angela drove from the library to the shop, stopping along the way at a deli. Maybe she was pregnant and had conceived during an erotic dream. She bought the strangest thing to eat, a foot-long German sausage and a loaf of bread. She didn't even touch the bread, though. She gobbled down the sausage as she drove along Highway 17. It was only when she was done that she realized it hadn't been cooked. Still tasted great. Cheap Stuff looked cheap from the outside. A wooden shack built against an aging brick home. It was set back from the road and had a peeling wooden pony standing guard outside on a lawn of dust. Angela parked and went in. The great-great-granddaughter greeted her. It had to be the woman. She was Native American, and she had a blanket in her hands that she wanted to show Angela. "I'm really here to see Shining Feather," Angela said, glancing about. The shop held shelves of pottery, woven baskets, hand-carved wooden figures, nothing that would interest a young woman raised in shopping malls. "Feather, he's taking nap," the woman said. She was about 30 and very fat. She wore her black hair in a long, thick ponytail that reached past her waist. She shoved her blanket into Angela's arms. "This I give you for $60. It's a genuine Manton blanket." The brown blanket looked as if it had been purchased at Walmart, and then had a couple of white pictographs sewn on it with thread. "I don't have $60, Angela said, "but I have a report on the Manton that I have to finish for class Monday. It's real important I speak to your great-great-grandfather. Could I come back at a later time?" The woman was interested. "Are you saying good things about us?" "Very good things." "How much money do you have?" "About $2. The woman reached for a small clay figure on a nearby shelf. It was of a young native girl. "I'll sell you this, and then go wake Feather." "I don't want you to wake him. He might not like that." The woman shrugged and put the figure in a brown bag. "He sleeps all the time. I'll have to wake him sooner or later, so that he can go to the bathroom." Angela handed over her remaining $2, and the woman disappeared into the back. Angela decided she definitely had to stop at an ATM on the way home. She wasn't going back to her grandfather's place without groceries. She checked the time, 5:32. Jim had said he wanted to see her again at 7. The woman reappeared and gestured that Angela was to follow her into the house portion of the structure, which was a questionable improvement over the retail part. They went through a messy kitchen and an impoverished living room into a tiny bedroom. Here things were neater. The bed was made and the window was opened, facing the sunset. The room smelled nice. A stick of incense burned in the corner. Shining Feathers sat wrapped in a blanket in front of a fuzzy TV. He didn't look as if he'd been asleep at all. He glanced over as Angela entered and said something she did not understand. "What?" she mumbled. He said, "Hi, how are you?" the woman said. "He doesn't speak English?" she asked. "He used to, but he's forgotten most of it. He prefers Manton. I will translate for you." She pointed. Sit there in front of him on that blanket. You like that blanket? I got it at Walmart, on sale. It's very fine, Angela said, taking her place on the floor at the old man's feet. He was small and bent. The threads of white hair on his head were few and far between, but his skin was not excessively wrinkled for someone of his great age, and his black eyes, as they peered down at her, were keen and alert. It was almost as if he saw things about her she'd rather he couldn't see. What have I got to hide? Things. A strange story of monsters, an illicit kiss, a warehouse stained with blood, a huge appetite. She was keeping a few secrets these days. Hello, she said to the old man. He nodded. He might have understood some English, even if he didn't speak it. He said something to the woman in Manton. Feather wants you to mention in your report that the Manton were the greatest warriors that ever lived, the woman said. Angela smiled back at Shining Feather. Tell him that I have already done that. The woman translated her words before Angela continued. Tell him that I would like to ask him some questions about Point Lake. Once more, the woman relayed the message. Angela was surprised when Shining Feather forcibly shook his head. He doesn't want to talk about the lake, the woman said. He says it's a bad place. That's specifically what I wanted to talk to him about, Angela said. Shining Feather continued to speak. He says he was the one who convinced some white settlers not to drink the water from the lake, the woman translated. He says they didn't listen to him at first, but they learned to listen. He says that all the water drunk in the area comes from wells, not the lake, and he is responsible for that. Angela shook her head. Tell him that the water for the new school that was built on the lake comes from the lake, and that several kids have gotten sick at the school, and that we don't know what the sickness is. After the woman relayed the message, Shining Feather grew agitated. He pulled his blanket tighter and squirmed in his seat. He began to speak more rapidly than before. He says the sickness is from the water in the lake, the woman said, and that children must not drink the water. He says if they stop immediately, they will get better. But if they don't stop, terrible things will happen to them. He says you must go to the people in charge of the school and alert them to the danger. He says this happens before to white settlers. Many of them got sick until they listened to him. But he says all those settlers got better just by staying away from the water. Ask him what things will happen if people continue to drink the water, Angela said. The old man shook his head when the question was relayed. He will not speak of it, the woman said. Why not? Angela asked. The old man kept shaking his head. He says you don't want to know what will happen, the woman said. Ask him why the lake was named Sethia by the Manton, Angela said. Shining Feather responded. He says you don't want to know, the woman said. Tell him I know the name means the bath of blood, Angela said. Shining Feather became silent for a moment, staring at her. Finally, he spoke softly to his great-great-granddaughter. He wants to know what else you know, the woman said. Tell him I have read about the Katu and that I... Shining Feather interrupted her with a yell. He shook his head vigorously and began to speak in Manton. You are not to say that word, the woman said. He says it is an evil word from an evil time, but he wants to know why you want to know about that word. Angela looked the old man in the eye. Tell him that several of the kids at the school may have changed in some way, and I'm wondering if they have changed into Katu. Shining Feather was obviously disgusted that she had said the cursed word again because he did not immediately respond. When he did, his voice was once more soft. He wants to know in what way the children have changed, the woman said. He wants to know if anyone has died, and he wants to know how they died. She added, This is weird. 2 people have died, Angela said. They were killed by a girl who was convinced the people had changed into something evil, but the people, before they died, might have killed others. Angela paused. They might have eaten 4 people alive. Shining Feather was distressed by her answer. He continued to watch her, his eyes more alert than before, less kind. He spoke again. He wants to know if the girl was able to kill all the strange children, the woman said. No, Angela said. Shining Feather spoke. How many are still alive? The woman asked. I don't know, Angela said. Why did the Manton call the lake the bath of blood? Shining Feather answered. Because it was where the drinking of blood always started, the woman said. I don't understand, Angela said. The lake was filled with blood? Shining Feather responded. The lake is filled with water, the woman said. He doesn't want to say the word, are filled with blood. I'm confused, Angela said. Are the Katu normal people who have changed as a result of drinking the water in the lake? Shining Feather scowled at the word. It really annoyed him. Angela didn't know how to get around using it. He responded, "He says that nothing about the changed ones is normal," the woman said. "He says they change all at once, but very slowly too." "What does that mean?" Angela asked. "He's contradicting himself." Shining Feather spoke. "He says they change on the inside before they change on the outside," the woman said. "They are hard to recognize at first." "How can you recognize them?" Angela asked. Shining Feather's eyes bored into her as he spoke. "They are always hungry for blood," the woman said. "No, I don't want blood. I just want hamburgers and sausage. I don't want blood." "Oh no," Angela whispered. Shining Feather suddenly leaned over and grabbed Angela's wrist. She tried to shake off his hold, but he was strong. He tightened his grip and felt along the soft tissue just below her thumb. He was feeling for her pulse. She went still and let him complete his examination. He didn't like what he found. A few seconds later, he threw her hand aside and pointed angrily toward the door, yelling something in Manton at her. "He wants you to get out," the woman said, getting up in a hurry. She took Angela by the arm and pulled her to her feet. "He wants you to get out now and never come back. You've upset him." "But I have to talk to him some more," Angela protested. The woman wouldn't let go of her. Angela was literally being dragged out the door, but she was able to shake free and took a step back toward the old man, who continued to watch her as if she had the plague. "What's wrong with me?" she demanded. "Why are you treating me this way?" She couldn't believe his response, especially after the way he had carried on about the word. "Katu," he said. "You must leave now," the woman ordered. "I am not Katu," Angela screamed. "I am a teenage girl. Why do you accuse me of that when I come to you for help?" "Get out of here," the woman said, grabbing at her hand again. "Leave me alone," Angela yelled, shaking her off. She took another step toward Shining Feather. Even though he saw her as evil, he was not afraid of her. "Why do you call me Katu?" she demanded. "I've hurt no one." "What want?" the old man asked, and though it was broken English, his question was clear. "I want to know if this thing is real," Angela said, "and if it is real, I want to know how to stop it before it spreads." Shining Feather reached up and removed a small gold chain from around his neck. He held it out to her. At the end of the chain was a tiny golden amulet of a hanging bat, which had been hidden beneath his shirt. Angela took it and studied it closely. The bat was missing its head. Shining Feather nodded. "Got to." Angela frowned. "What happened to its head?" "Where?" he said. "Around my neck? But what good will that do?" She was desperate. "What am I supposed to do?" The man made a slashing motion at his neck. "Kill them," he said. "Who?" "The hungry ones," he said. "I have to cut off their heads?" she asked. "Kill them," he repeated. "What about me?" she asked. "Am I infected too?" He glanced out the window in the direction of the setting sun. The bloated orange globe was already halfway over the side of the earth, falling into nighttime. The room had begun to darken, to grow chilly. Angela felt a shiver go through the length of her body as the old man turned his eyes back on her. "Hungry?" he asked. She nodded weakly. She was starving right now, all the time. "The water, the blood." He shook his head sadly and muttered something in Manton. Angela gestured to the woman. "What did he say?" Angela asked. "You swam too deep," the woman said. "But I have never swum in the lake. It's too cold." Shining Feather lowered his head and spoke in Manton. "What?" Angela said. "Your blood is as cold as the lake," the woman translated. Angela could feel her heart pounding, but what flowed through her veins she no longer knew. "I think I will leave," she said. The woman was spooked. "I think you had better." Chapter 8. On the way home, Angela found a grocery store that took personal checks, so she didn't have to locate an ATM. She bought all kinds of food, it was true, but who was she fooling? She purchased more red meat than she and her grandfather ordinarily ate in a month. Big steaks, fat steaks. She asked the man in the meat department if he had any cattle in the back, and he didn't laugh because she wasn't laughing when she asked him. She almost cried when a cashier asked if she was expecting company. "Yes," Angela said. "They're from out of town." Plastic was waiting for her at the door when she got home. She was whining. Angela had forgotten to feed her that morning. Angela searched for a can of dog food but couldn't find any. She ended up tossing Plastic a raw steak on her upstairs balcony that overlooked the lake. The dog chewed away happily. Angela was cooking herself a steak when the front door opened and in walked Jim Klein, star quarterback, Heavy water drinker. Batman himself. He still had his head on his shoulders. He looked up at her in the kitchen, a level above, and nodded. It was dark, and the only light she had on was a small lamp on a table in the living room, beside where he stood. It didn't seem to bother him. Her steak sizzled on the hot pan. "Hello, Angie," he said. "Am I early?" "No. Come in. I was just making dinner. Are you hungry?" "I'm starving," he said. "So, my darling boy, are you a monster? Do you eat people? Do you want to eat me? Do I have to kill you? Are you from another planet? Are you evil? What do you want to do tonight? Kiss me, love me, make me more like yourself? Ah, my darling boy, isn't that why you asked me out? Isn't that why you came to this world? To consume all the pretty young babes, and make them more evil than they already are?" "Should we eat here?" Angela asked when she had 2 steaks sizzling in the black pan. Jim sat silently at the kitchen table, watching her in the dark. "At the oil wells," he said. "You want to hike up there?" "Yes." "Fine." She knew why she hadn't gone for her grandfather's shotgun. First of all, he didn't have one. Second, there was a part of her that was in love with the dark side. There always had been, really. It was probably the same with all people. Jim both repelled and attracted her. His manner was cold. He was making no pretense of loving her tonight. He probably realized it was unnecessary. The baptism, whatever he had done to her, was complete, and she was already damned, at least from his point of view. There were also the things Mary had told her about him. Angela still couldn't say she believed Mary, but she didn't disbelieve her, either. That was saying a lot. If Jim wasn't a monster, he was far from being a normal jock. "I want to eat and look down at the lake," he said. "It sounds romantic," she replied. She wasn't being sarcastic, because she truly was looking forward to being with him in the worst way. It was as if her mind were operating on 2 levels. He was bad, but he was so bad he looked good. She was dying for him to kiss her, to touch her. She craved his fingers on her as much as she craved juicy steaks. But he wasn't horny for her. He just sat there staring at her. "You look pretty tonight," he said. "Thank you," she said. She hadn't meant for him to come. She had planned to keep her promise to Kevin, to herself, intending to call him to say she wasn't feeling well. But she had gotten home late, and had had to make herself something to eat, and then he had just walked in. "What did you do today?" Jim asked. "Nothing." "Did you see Mary?" "Yes." "What did she say?" "Nothing," she said. Then there was the feeling that she needed him. Her body was changing. A doctor wouldn't understand how, but Jim knew. She could see subtle signs of change in him, too. His right hand rested on the kitchen table. His fingernails, as if they had been caught in something heavy, were all black. He tapped them lightly on the wooden tabletop and sent rhythmic echoes through the silent house. "Is the steak almost done?" he asked. "I just put it on." "It doesn't matter." "I guess not." She turned off the flame. "Let's go. I'll put the food in a sack." But everything she thought about Jim and her reaction to him was also absurd. She hadn't yet forgotten she was a human being. She certainly wasn't ready to kill anybody. She would die before she did that. In the bathroom, before leaving the house, she put Shining Feather's amulet on under her shirt. She didn't know what protection it could afford her, maybe none, but she kept it close to her skin nevertheless. It reminded her of the old man's command. "Kill them, the hungry ones." Jim didn't say a word as they hiked up to the oil wells, and she didn't mind. It was all she could do to catch her breath as she tried to keep up with him. He carried the sack of food, though. The smell of it pulled her like a leash on a puppy. She had tossed a loaf of bread and a bottle of wine in with the steaks. The wells were tall, insect-like creatures. There were only 6 that she could see, not the 12 he had mentioned. They plowed the earth with tireless indifference, sucking it dry of its natural resources. Yet in the light of the moon they were sensual. The silver light gleamed on the oily tubing, up and down, in and out, pumping. Her thoughts reeled in lustful circles. If Jim had tried to undress her at that moment, she would have wished for scissors to help him. They sat at the concrete footing of one of the wells. The valley and the lake stretched splendidly out beneath them. They reached for their food. Jim ate and drank some of everything, but Angela just wanted her steak. Extra rare, if it could be called that. She ate with her hands, and that made it taste all the better. "The lake is round," Jim said when they were done eating. He was right, of course. The water appeared a perfect circle when seen from above. From space, in the moonlight, it probably appeared to be a single pale eye. A cloud could cross the sky and make the eye blink. Angela considered telling Jim her nightmare, but dismissed the idea. She didn't know what he knew of her suspicions. Better to keep it that way, in case she had to kill him after she loved him. But she was no Mary. She still couldn't imagine killing anybody. "I hear it was formed by a meteor," she said. "It was, 100,000 years ago." She turned to him. "How did you know that?" He shrugged. "It's known. Can you imagine it? A hunk of rock comes hurtling out of the sky and crashes here. In a fraction of a second, the impact liberates more energy than 1,000 nuclear warheads. This valley is formed, and for days on end it is a valley of fire, of molten iron rock melting deeper and deeper into the earth, becoming a part of it, cooling finally, and leaving a bowl for the water to gather in." "Sethia," she said. His description evoked powerful images. It was almost as if he had been there to witness the coming of the meteor. He frowned. "I don't know that name." "That's what the Manton called Point Lake." "What does it mean?" "I don't know," she said. "How's your arm?" He had on a long-sleeved shirt. She couldn't remember if he had cut the right or left arm. She wondered if he could. "It's better," he said. "Is it bandaged?" "Yes." "Does it hurt?" she asked. "No." He stood suddenly. "Let's go." "Where?" "Swimming." "Should you go swimming with your cut?" "I don't care," he said. She felt fear. "The water's cold." He stuck out his arm. "You'll be hot by the time you walk back down." She was sweating by the time they reached her house. She didn't know what was going to happen next. The fact was, a potential Katu was asking her to go swimming in a bath of blood. Of course, people swam in the lake all summer, and none of them ate their neighbors. She wondered if it was possible that she would look back on these days when she was 30 years old, and wonder if she hadn't been taking drugs. She certainly had thrown logic to the wind. She was close to believing in monsters, and at the same time she wanted to sleep with one. Jim kissed her the moment they stepped inside her house. He kept on kissing her. It was better than the previous night. He was better. He was a hunk of male meat wrapped around the deepest nerve in her body. It was cool, she thought. He could eat her when he was done, as long as she got to watch. He ran his hands over the front of her blouse, and she moaned with pleasure and pain, never realizing before how close the two could be. She wanted him so bad it hurt. He led her deeper into the house, up to her bedroom, but they didn't stop there, more's the pity, she thought. He opened the door onto the balcony. Plastic looked up from her white steak bone and dashed inside the house. Jim stepped out and surveyed the calm lake. The air was even warmer than it had been the night before, silent as a tomb. "Let's swim," he said. "Don't you want to exercise another way?" "How deep is this lake?" she asked aloud. "Deeper than you imagine." He pulled off his shirt. He was built like Hercules. His right arm was bandaged. He flashed a faint smile, his first smile of the evening, when he saw her eyes dart to the white gauze. "Do you still have your cold?" he asked. She hesitated. "No." He began to take off his pants. "Can you swim?" "I can swim," she said. She thought about the amulet around her neck. She didn't want him to see it. "But I have to go to the bathroom first." "Go." He was practically naked. She ran inside the bathroom and pulled off the gold bat with no head. She couldn't imagine what it symbolized. The Katu surely were not bats. They were supposed to be alien monsters. She stuffed it in the medicine cabinet. She heard a loud splash. He had already dived in. This was her chance. She could run out to her car and drive away. She could go over to Kevin's house and huddle in front of his TV and watch a rented horror movie and eat popcorn and have a nice, normal, safe Saturday night. But something kept her where she was, and she had another insight into what it was. She was horny as hell, sure, but who really believed in monsters? And if there was an evil force at work there, then she couldn't simply run away and pretend it didn't exist. "What am I supposed to do? You tell me that Jim's walking death on the loose, and I'm just supposed to sit back and see if he kills somebody? You should be happy I went out with him. I'm carrying on your research." She had yelled it at Mary spontaneously, but it must have come from deep inside. She had to get close to Jim to see what he was. It was the only way she'd be able to make up her mind what to do. Angela did not reach for a bathing suit as she walked back to the balcony. It was research, after all. Jim was 100 feet out. He waved as she stepped into the moonlight. "Come on," he called. Sethia, bath of blood, Katu, cold as the lake. "Coming," Angela whispered. She slipped out of her clothes and let them fall on the boards. The night air touched her where she was seldom seen. She crept to the edge and peered down. The water glittered like a million-faceted diamond. She did not know how deep it was at the edge. She didn't want to break her neck and end up paralyzed like poor Fred Keith. "Hurry," Jim shouted. "Okay," she said mostly to herself. It would be okay. She jumped in. The shock was so complete, she didn't register it at first. Her feet sank down without touching the bottom. She kicked up vigorously and broke the surface. Then the cold hit her. She could have landed on an iceberg. "Ah!" she yelled. Far out on the ice pool, Jim snorted. "Swim," he called. "It will warm you up." He was wrong about that. The farther she swam from shore, the colder she got. She suspected she was losing body heat faster than any form of exercise would generate it. There was no way she could stay in more than a minute. But then Jim met her and pulled her toward him and kissed her again. She could feel his body against hers, and realized Mr. Shining Feather was wrong about this guy, and how cold he was. Too hot to be cold was all she could think, as his mouth pressed against hers. A powerful warmth flowed beneath her shivering flesh, sucking the blood deep into the nerve endings she never imagined lived inside her body. She tilted her head back and went limp in his arms, letting him hold her afloat as his tongue slid over her throat. Straight overhead she could see the moon, cut in two by the shadow of space, and she felt somehow cut in pieces because, try as she might, she couldn't squeeze him close enough to quench her longing for him. He was one huge steak, as rare as God made them, and she was lucky above all the girls on the planet to find him. "Sweet," she whispered aloud. Jim suddenly snapped her head back onto his mouth, and her ecstasy deepened beyond recovery, even with the sharp pain that stabbed into her mouth. She had bit her tongue, or maybe he had done it, but the taste of blood in her mouth was the taste of pleasure. The pounding in her head that had plagued her all day returned 1,000-fold, but now she fed it with a juice she had never dreamed of. It seemed to come out of Jim and into her mouth, where blood swam around their tongues like a forbidden elixir swirled in a sacred chalice. Yet there was so much of it that she couldn't imagine that it all belonged to her. But that was the heart of this seduction. Nothing belonged to anybody. Throw your body and soul into the temptation. Let it all come back in tremors of satisfaction. Kissing him with such joy that the pounding in her brain was drowned by the sensation, swept away on a wet wind that blew from out of time, a wind that washed away her last thread of innocence and left her naked in the center of the cold lake. How long he held her, she wasn't sure. It seemed an eon had elapsed when he finally led her by the hand out of the water and up onto her balcony. Her skin was white marble. The drops of water that clung to it were like shards of ice. Yet she no longer shivered. She wasn't even sure if she still breathed. They went into her bedroom and lay on the sheets beside each other. He looked at her, and she stared at him. His eyes were deep and wide. She could see space inside them that belonged to another dimension. They were also her own eyes, newborn twins, seen in unnatural reflection. She watched her own alien landscape unfolding in them even as she closed her eyes and fell into darkness. She was in the mind of the immortal world, but she was not on the world. Her body was being sent away to feed. Her body, not her soul. She didn't have or need one of the latter. She had the mind of the world, and the world was always hungry. As she flew through the black abyss, she dreamed of satisfying her cravings on the flesh of those who had been called brother and sister, but who were now enemies, only to be destroyed. After some time she felt the wind on her face. The sun, a huge ball of fire in the sky, stung her eyes. Everything seemed strange to her, and yet she knew this place. Her body had grown up here. This was the earth, and this had been home before she had been consumed by the world. She felt no nostalgia upon returning, only her need to feed. In the distance, she saw human beings approach. She smiled and waved at them as she stepped away from the vehicle that had brought her to Earth. She spoke to them. They were happy to see her again. They thought she was the one who had left the Earth months earlier to explore the world. They didn't know that the whole time she spoke to them, she thought only of how they would taste. Later, in the dark, she would know. The sun was too bright. It made her feel weak. She was anxious to get inside and sleep, and dream. She dreamed many dreams. That was all there was in the mind of the world. Nightmare upon nightmare. There was no need to awake, it constantly whispered. But her body eventually awoke and went forward with a vengeance. Time passed, nights of feeding. Days of deception, nights of stalking, then, in the end, days of hiding, of fleeing, because in time all the close friends of the body she inhabited were dead and eaten, or else they were like herself, running from those who begun to suspect that the far-off world was not a place to build a second home, but a place to die a death that never ended. In the end, hiding became much more difficult, because as time passed, the body changed into a thing that brought terror to those who laid eyes upon it. Yet this new body was superior in many ways. It was stronger. It could fly. She could feed in one spot and be many miles away a short time later, but she had also changed in a manner different from anything that walked the earth. She could no longer disguise herself or her true purpose. Feeding became difficult, then next to impossible. She began to weaken. The sun became intolerable, and she shunned it in the depths of the earth. But that was a mistake, for she boxed herself in. With a group of those she had transformed, she was cornered in a black cave. Humans in red uniforms broke in. Handheld weapons that fired beams of burning ruby light flashed before her eyes. One of her kind was hauled into the circle of weapons and decapitated by a beam that cut down everything in its path. Then another of her kind was killed, and still another, until she was all that remained. The humans gathered around her, and there was triumph in their eyes. But she did not beg for mercy. She was part of the world. It would live forever. More humans would travel from the third planet to the fifth, and more of her kind would take birth. The seeds of the world would spread. In the end, its hunger would be satisfied, which was her last thought as her head was sliced from her body. Angela awoke and opened her eyes. She lay all alone on top of her bed. She was freezing cold and had to pull the blankets over her. As she did so, she saw Jim sitting naked on the balcony, staring out at the dark water of the lake. "Jim," she called, "come back to bed." He ignored her. His body was so ghostly in the light of the moon, it could have been made of imagination. She talked to him in a minute. Now she was hungry. Getting up, she crept into the kitchen. The clock read exactly 12 midnight. But the second hand did not move as she watched it. Broken, she thought. It felt much later than midnight. She opened the icebox and took out 2 steaks. They sizzled in the pan as she turned up the flame of the stove, but she didn't let them cook long. She just wanted to take the chill off, make them taste as if they had been alive not long before. She ate both steaks without asking Jim if he wanted one. He could get his own food, she thought. Later, when she returned to the bedroom, Jim was no longer on the balcony or anywhere else. She stepped out into the night and peered at the water, watching the ripples rock back and forth. They were strong in the immediate area. It was as if someone had just dived in. "Jim?" she called. She had heard no splash. "Jim?" And as she waited, nobody surfaced. "Cethia," she whispered. The word filled her with dread, yet seemed to bring her back to her senses. She turned and walked back into the house. In the bathroom, she took the amulet Shining Feather had given her and placed it around her neck. Almost immediately she remembered her nightmare and her long, cold swim with Jim. Her tongue ached in her mouth. He had bitten her. Or had she bitten both of them? She could not be sure. Once more, as it had the previous night, her stomach lurched, and she thought she'd vomit up the meat she had just eaten. But the steaks stayed down, and soon she was able to get back into bed and cover herself. She fell asleep, holding on to the decapitated bat. Horrible as the gold carving was, it seemed to keep away the bad dreams.